In 1944, Theodosius Dobzhansky wrote a sentence that should have transformed the field of human evolutionary studies. On the basis of the available data, there is no reason to suppose that more than a single hominid species has existed on any time level in the Pleistocene. Particularly the findings on Mount Carmel prove that the Neanderthal and modern types were populations of the same species rather than distinct species. In the 1980s, many archaeologists believed that the finds represented a species in transition from Neanderthal to Cro-Magnon, that they were a hybrid population, or that Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons were in the process of merging to form a single race. However, at the same time, Dr. Chris Stringer called for Neanderthals to be recognized as a separate species that evolved in parallel with modern humans before disappearing. Now, a groundbreaking new study is suggesting that the origins of Cro-Magnons could go back 300,000 years. The caves of Mount Carmel near the shores of the eastern Mediterranean became one of the most important stages in the history of human paleontology during the early 1930s. At School Cave, cave teams uncovered human remains that did not fit comfortably into the rigid evolutionary categories of the time. These fossils looked modern in many respects, yet retained traits that echoed older, more robust hominins. Dobzhansky's use of the Mount Carmel fossils was especially provocative. School 5 displayed a mosaic of traits, some characteristic of what later researchers would call classic Neanderthals, others firmly within the anatomical range of modern humans. For decades, scholars debated whether these remains represented hybrids, early moderns, late archaics, or something entirely new. They were neither classic Neanderthals nor comfortably aligned with the fully modern humans emerging in Europe tens of thousands of years later. Instead of forcing the fossils into a narrative of failure and extinction, the original excavators understood that they represented something far more complex, an early transitional population standing at the threshold of modern humanity. Early researchers approached the fossils not as ideological symbols, but as biological realities demanding careful interpretation. When Macau examined the school skeletons, he identified what they described as early modern or proto-sapiens morphology, acknowledging both their anatomical modernity and their evolutionary proximity to more archaic populations. The School Cave people possessed vertical foreheads, reduced prognathism, and brain sizes within or approaching the modern human range. Yet they also displayed robust brow ridges, thick cranial bones, and facial strength uncommon in later Upper Paleolithic Europeans. Macau did not regard these traits as signs of evolutionary failure, but rather as evidence of an early stage in sapiens development. He proposed that these people represented a population in transition, evolving in situ in the Near East, and shaped by local environmental and genetic pressures. For Macau, these fossils demonstrated that modern humans did not emerge from Africa in a single recent wave, but through a more protracted and regionally complex process. This interpretation was later simplified, then dismissed. As the second half of the 20th century progressed, and as the out-of-Africa replacement model grew in dominance, the School and Kafze fossils were reclassified as a failed migration. The argument proposed that an early group of Homo sapiens left Africa around 120,000 years ago, briefly occupied the Levant, and then vanished completely, either succumbing to climatic reversal or being replaced by Neanderthals. This imaginary extinction conveniently preserved the idea that the only successful exodus occurred around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, creating a neat narrative of total replacement and evolutionary reset. Indeed, the fossils themselves never supported such a simplistic story. What has changed today is not the bones, but the analytical framework applied to them. The new morphological and evolutionary clustering shown in this chart from a groundbreaking recent study, co-authored by Chris Stringer, fundamentally undermines the concept of school as a doomed cul-de-sac of humanity. Instead, it places School and Kafze within a deep Eurasian lineage that diverges from African Homo sapiens approximately 500,000 years ago, and then splits again into separate branches, one leading toward Mladeč around 300,000 years ago. This reframes the entire narrative. School is no longer a biological dead end. It is a trunk population. This 500,000-year divergence is staggering in its implications. It suggests that the ancestors of School and Kafse had already been evolving outside Africa for far longer than traditionally assumed. Rather than representing a brief excursion from Africa, they represent part of a long-standing Eurasian presence, possibly linked to the same broad population movements that produced early Homo heidelbergensis-like groups across the Levant and Western Asia. The Levant, far from being a temporary corridor, becomes a zone of prolonged habitation, adaptation, and evolutionary continuity. It is within this framework that Mladeč takes on its true significance. The Mladeč skulls from Moravia, dated to approximately 35,000 years ago, have long been recognized as some of the earliest modern human remains in Central Europe. Yet they've often been lumped uncritically into the category of recent out-of-African migrants, as though they were simply another arrival from Africa via the successful later migration. In reality, the anatomy of Mladeč does not support this interpretation. Mladeč crania display a curious mosaic of features. The cranial vault is high and rounded, consistent with Homo sapiens, yet the facial skeleton remains robust. The brow ridges are reduced compared to Neanderthals, but are still more prominent than in later Upper Paleolithic Europeans. The occipital region shows thickness and curvature that place it between classic Neanderthals and fully gracile modern humans. The midface is strong, the bone dense, and the overall cranial morphology carries echoes of deep ancestry. This is not what one expects from a freshly arrived African population that supposedly replaced all prior groups. Instead, Mladeč looks like the descendant of a population that had already been shaped by long-term Eurasian adaptation, genetic drift, and interaction with Neanderthal populations. When the new model places Mladeč on a branch splitting from School around 300,000 years ago, the anatomical reality of the skull suddenly aligns with evolutionary logic. It represents continuity, not interruption. It suggests long continuity in Eurasia, likely in Persia or even further to the east, and genetic studies are backing up this evidence. Under this model, School and Kafse are no longer evolutionary anomalies awkwardly explained away as failures. They become foundational populations that survived through harsh climatic phases, retreated into refugia, interbred with regional groups, and eventually re-emerged during the Upper Paleolithic as part of the peoples who repopulated Europe. The idea of a complete extinction, followed by a pristine replacement, becomes increasingly untenable. The historical dismissal of Macau and Dobzhansky now appears less an act of scientific progress and more a consequence of theoretical fashion. Their insistence on anatomical continuity and regional evolution was inconvenient for a theory seeking elegant simplicity. Yet modern genetic and morphological data are steadily vindicating their instincts. The new split dates do not merely adjust timelines. They resurrect an entire school of thought once set aside. The School excavations themselves deserve renewed historical attention. The care with which the skeletons were uncovered, recorded and compared reflects a depth of scholarship often ignored in modern summaries. Macau's detailed anatomical descriptions, including of cranial thickness, dental structure and facial morphology, demonstrate that he did not view these people as evolutionary dead ends. He understood them as real populations with biological histories, not as temporary markers on a migration map. Macau and Dobzhansky were remarkably prescient in this regard. They believed that modern humanity emerged through a long process of regional differentiation and convergence rather than instantaneous global replacement. The School skulls were to them evidence of this gradual transformation. The later narrative that reduced them to failed migrants stripped them of their real evolutionary significance. Nearly 100 years ago, long before DNA sequencing and long before the political requirements of anthropology hardened into rigid models of replacement and purity, Theodore Macau excavated and analyzed a series of skeletons from the caves of School and Taban on Mount Carmel that revealed a remarkably complex and entangled human past. Macau stands today as one of the most overlooked but most prescient figures in the entire history of paleoanthropology, a scientist whose meticulous observations at Mount Carmel revealed the truth, long before genetics had the tools to prove it, and whose revolutionary conclusions about hybridization, continuity, and the shared ancestry of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were quietly dismissed in the late 20th century, only to be vindicated dramatically by the genomic breakthroughs of the 21st. What Macau and Dobzhansky saw in those fossils was not a sequence of separate species replacing one another in some clean and linear march toward modernity, but a blended population, a hybrid zone, a dynamic interface where human groups met, interacted, influenced one another, and ultimately helped shape the genetic legacy of the modern world. Yet despite the clarity of the evidence and the boldness of his interpretation, Macau and Dobzhansky's hybrid model was later pushed aside and largely erased from the dominant narrative once the out-of-Africa replacement theory rose to power, a model that insisted on strict species boundaries, total replacement of archaic populations, and a simplified version of human origins that demanded a pure African exodus with no meaningful admixture. Africans are not a single homogeneous group, so the slogan, "We are all Africans," is meaningless. Africa is the most diverse continent on Earth, so this slogan marginalizes nearly every group inside Africa in favor of one pure population. The story of how Macau was right, how his work was buried, and how genetics ultimately vindicated him is one of the most dramatic and unjust episodes in the history of human origins research. His work, the monumental 600-page volume The Stone Age of Mount Carmel, demonstrated through bone morphology, cranial vaulting, facial structures, dental traits, and postcranial anatomy that early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals not only overlapped in time and space, but interbred, shared culture, and produced populations whose bodies carried a mosaic of traits from both lineages. Macau's insight emerged directly from the bones themselves. Working under Dorothy Garrett's direction at Mount Carmel during the excavations of the early 1930s, Macau uncovered a series of skeletons whose anatomical traits defied easy classification. Skull 5 possessed a strongly archaic brow ridge, reminiscent of Neanderthals, and a long, low cranial vault, yet also displayed a projecting chin and a more gracile facial structure associated with early modern humans. Other individuals, such as Skull 4, combined robust Neanderthal-like limb morphology with unmistakably modern dental and mandibular traits. The tabun remains further complicated the picture, showing classic Neanderthal characteristics in some bones, while also suggesting possible contact with Skull populations. Macau concluded that these fossils represented a single variable population composed of part Neanderthal and part modern human ancestry, a blended human group inhabiting the Levant long before the supposed exodus from Africa. The Mount Carmel fossils represented intermixed populations, and that Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens existed as populations of the same species rather than separate evolutionary lineages. This conclusion, reached in 1939, should have become the foundation for a more complex, realistic model of human origins. However, the out-of-Africa replacement theory provided a single origin, a single exodus, a single pure species, and the disappearance of archaic humans through replacement rather than interaction. In this intellectual climate, the hybrid model was not merely inconvenient, it was unacceptable. The Levantine fossils he described had to be reinterpreted as early, almost moderns, who left no descendants, evolutionary false starts who were replaced by the true Homo sapiens emerging from Africa much later. Now, with the emergence of deep morphological clustering suggesting a 500,000-year separation from African sapiens and a 300,000-year continuity toward Mladeč, the Skull Kafze group finally reclaim their rightful position within human history. They become not the ghosts of a failed adventure, but the ancestors of a distinct Eurasian lineage that shaped the very foundation of Upper Paleolithic Europe. The Mladeč skull stands as the physical testament to this survival. It embodies the persistence of early Eurasian Homo sapiens through ice ages, population bottlenecks, and genetic entanglement with Neanderthals. Its mixed morphology is not confusion, It is history written in bone. It is the visible trace of a lineage that did not vanish but endured. What emerges from this reinterpretation is not a rejection of African origins, but a rejection of simplistic replacement. Humanity did not advance through neat erasures and clean arrivals. It advanced through continuity, overlap and survival. School and Kafse were not failures. They were beginnings, and Mladeč was their echo across hundreds of thousands of years of Eurasian time. Thanks for watching.